this is really inspiring, actually, how things are changing and how we're adapting. I'd like to start by citing UN Secretary Antonio Guterres, who spoke on the 1st of January this year, and he said, "We enter 2020 with uncertainty and insecurity all around, persistent inequality and rising hatred, a warring world and a warming planet. We cannot afford to be the generation that fiddled while the planet burned." And he specifically appealed to young people, saying the world needs young people to keep speaking out, keep thinking big, keep pushing boundaries, and keep up the pressure. And I wonder, how does that make you feel? Energized, hopeful, or depressed, or all of those things and more, maybe anxious, maybe angry? And all of this was before COVID-19. And now research shows that 40 to 50% of young people are feeling significantly more anxious than they did before the outbreak. So how do you feel? If you could put that in the chat, it might be interesting to get a mini survey of your experience. And I want to talk about how media and cultural studies and social science can help us raise some important questions. So is there more uncertainty now than before? Why? For whom? What are the consequences? So is there more uncertainty now than before? Yes. Young people in previous societies had more certainty, definitely. If you were born a young woman in feudal England, you could see the shape of your life reflected around you. If you were the daughter of a wealthy farmer, you'd soon find yourself married to another wealthy farmer. Status was something that stayed with people, and people stayed in these positions. And still in the 1950s, if you were a young man, you'd most likely follow your dad into a job. There was very little social mobility. I'm going very quickly through history, but modernity then brought such social mobility, flexibility, the possibility to rise and fall through social class and to shape your identity, sexuality, gender, and political awareness, relationships, life chances. And that brought great freedom, but also great pressure and anxiety. And as Bauman puts it, it even made our biographies malleable. It made malleable, changeable what we can be. So our own biographical experience appears fragile, vulnerable, and constantly torn apart. And one of the shearing forces that Bauman talks about that tears certainty apart is technology. We can see that today in how social media have accelerated and intensified the construction of identity, influence, and celebrity, and brought with it great opportunities for activism and mobilizing young people for important causes, but has also brought cyberbullying and loneliness as well as manipulation. And technology brought what Charles Perrault calls normal accidents. He argues that accidents, even disasters, are not exceptions. They are pre-programmed. They are normal, actually. This is because high-risk technologies like global logistics and mobility systems or the internet produce tightly coupled complexity where a small thing going wrong can have huge consequences. And we're really living that now. Making and using high-risk technologies, we inevitably increase uncertainty and things will go wrong. We can absolutely count that they will go wrong, but we will not know how. So they go wrong in unexpected ways, ways we cannot anticipate and cannot control. And Ulrich Beck's Risk Society concept builds on this and allows us to actually understand how this riskiness divides people. For some people, it is not possible to self-isolate at home during COVID-19. And also, while millions of people are regularly, as Allah described, displaced to often by extreme weather and climate change, the elites can escape to New Zealand, where it is expected that climate change will have less of an impact. So, what are the consequences of uncertainty? There are inequalities at different scales within societies and globally, and also between generations. That's one of the major outcomes of increasing uncertainty. And in the research that I'm doing with colleagues in Colombia and Cuba, we have found that, for example, transport really disadvantages people living in informal settlements on the steep hills around Cali in Colombia or in the Bay of Havana, which make social distancing, for example, impossible. There are only these collective taxis, and many of the jobs that people go to with these taxis in the city have actually dried up. For example, domestic work, especially for women, which then increases domestic violence. So those who are disadvantaged experience the uncertainty and the riskiness much harder than others. So what can we do about it? I really love this statement by Susan Sontag, a journalist and social critic. She wrote a book called Regarding the Pain of Others. It's on war photography and the mediation of suffering. And she says, when you think about this, actually set aside your sympathy for a reflection on how our privileges are located on the same map as their suffering. And the research that we do in many ways shows how we might not imagine or prefer not to imagine how these things are connected, but our privileges are linked to their suffering. The wealth of some does imply the destitution of others. And it does so in really complicated ways, but we can study it and we can change it. And images and stories of other people's lives can provide an initial spark for reflection, she argues, but that's not enough. And maps can take us a little deeper. So this map shows coronavirus cases outside of China on the 23rd of March. And the number of cases blows up the country proportionally. So it's a proportional map to the cases of COVID. And you can see Italy here, and you can hardly recognize it. It's the place with the most cases at that time. And if you look now, the situation has changed, and Latin America and the US are becoming the hotspots for the disease. And if you compare those maps with maps on inequality or on wealth, then you can start to trace how the effects of COVID are worse for those who are already disadvantaged. And I'm showing you those maps because with Anna Lovenhaupt-Singh, I think the time is ripe for sensing global precarity differently and enable articulation of more connected, equitable social and cultural alternatives. So we're realizing rather painfully with climate change and COVID right now that the future is uncertain for us personally, but also for humanity and the planet. And we can also see that our futures are social and the future is now. We are making it as we are living through this. And that makes me feel responsible. So if privileges are located on the same map as the suffering, then fighting to distribute resources more equitably and learning about the interdependencies between privilege and destitution is important. I guess that's the question for me. Yes. Well, I mean, as Joe just described, that's a lived experience. Could be receiving those kind of letters. And then the experience of precarity is, well, how do you answer? What do you do? And one question would then be, who do you turn to, and who do you have who you can turn to? So those are things, ways in which people experience it. But there are also more complicated questions like, COVID or climate change. They are invisible, one because it's very, very tiny, and one because it's absolutely massive and we can't sense it. And there we have lots of experts, and Beck, for example, writes about how we trust or do not trust, and how that affects public perceptions of risk. And just a third thing that I would like to add to it is that people have started to use mobile media to start sensing precarity. So after the Fukushima disaster, for example, people built their own Geiger counter. So there were YouTube videos about how to build your measuring device to know where the radiation was. And they crowdsourced a map to see where the risk was. So there are ways now that we are inventing of how to sense precarity differently.